The Iowa night in late March 1969 held none of the gentleness of spring. It bore the biting chill of late snow remnants melting away, turning the earth into an ocean of thick, slushy mud that sucked at everything it touched. Inside the Sterling family seed barn, the air wasn't warm but damp, heavy with the scent of rotting wood and the pungent, sharp tang of freshly delivered chemical fertilizer. Thomas sat motionless on a decaying wooden stool, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a long day spent prepping machinery. His leather boots were caked in gray mud the dense, heartland muck capable of swallowing a man's entire life if he wasn't careful. His hands, flushed red from the cold and blackened by engine oil, trembled slightly every time he clenched his fists. On a cobweb-covered wooden shelf, an old Zenith transistor radio fought through bands of static to bring in sounds from another world. The voice of an announcer excitedly recounted the feats of test flights preparing for the moon landing next summer. Humanity stands on the threshold of the stars. A giant leap is being prepared. Thomas smirked, a smile so bitter it turned the back of his throat dry. Humanity was soaring to the stars, but he was pinned down in the spring mud. Right beneath his feet, 80 acres of family land lay silent, cold, and besieged by bank vultures. This spring season of 1969 was the final gamble. If he couldn't sow the seeds the moment the ground was warm enough, if the aging 1950 Farmall collapsed in the muddy furrows, everything would end. Suddenly, headlights from the distant paved road swept through the cracks in the barn door, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It wasn't the light of hope, but the prowling of AgriCorp vehicles. They had bought up all the surrounding farms and were merely waiting for Thomas to exhaust himself so they could turn this place into a massive machinery lot. They called it the progress of modern agriculture. Pale spring moonlight filtered through holes in the tin roof, shining directly onto a light brown letter tucked into the wall, a draft notice for his younger brother, Billy. Billy was only 19. In Washington, politicians talked of peace, but here, Thomas understood that if he couldn't prove this farm was an essential food source, requiring Billy as key personnel, his brother would be thrown into the deathly mud of Vietnam instead of the fertile mud of Iowa. The world outside was turning on jet engines and songs of freedom. Thomas's world stood still amidst the wreckage of old hopes. The crackling radio shifted to a war report from central Vietnam, mingled with the wind whistling through the barn walls like the moaning of Mother Earth. Thomas slammed his hand onto the table in fury, nearly knocking the radio to the ground. He stared into the darkness where stacks of hybrid corn seed bags were piled. They weren't just seeds. They were Billy's ransom. They were the sole shield before AgriCorp's bulldozers leveled his father's memories. A sharp squeak from a rat echoed right by his feet, signaling that the enemy had begun its assault on this final treasure. Thomas no longer felt the cold. Anger had incinerated his exhaustion. He stood up, grabbed a flashlight, his gaze colder than the shovel blade leaning against the wall. "A giant leap, huh?" Thomas muttered, his hand tightening around a Winchester 894 hunting rifle. "Tomorrow, if I don't get these seeds into the ground, a man walking on the moon won't save this house." In the haunting silence of that 1969 Iowa spring night, Thomas stood there a silent sentry in the dark, ready to protect the seeds of life before spring slipped away. The squeaking rose again, this time not from one spot, but echoing from every corner of the vast wooden barn. Thomas stood tall, the ache in his bones from the long day pushed aside by a primal survival instinct. In the freezing silence of the Iowa night, his hearing became uncannily sharp. He heard tiny claws scratching against burlap sacks, and the plop-plop of dry corn kernels hitting the packed earth floor like raindrops before a storm. He clicked on the heavy maglite. The yellowish beam swept through the space, slicing the thick darkness in half. Immediately, dozens of tiny eyes, red as kidney beans, flared under the light, reflecting a terrifying boldness. They didn't flee at once. These 1969 Heartland rats were large and stubborn, accustomed to the presence of humans and old machines. Thomas took a deep breath. The sharp stench of rat urine, mixed with the musty smell of ruined seeds, hit his nose. He looked down at his feet. An expensive bag of Pioneer seed, something he had borrowed from across all of Stormy County to afford, had a large hole gnawed into it. The orange-yellow hybrid kernels, carefully selected to withstand the early spring cold, were now scattered everywhere, mingled with rodent waste. Filthy beasts. Thomas roared. He didn't use the Winchester. A gunshot would wake nosy neighbors, or worse, attract the attention of AgriCorp patrols looking for any reason to conclude he was incompetent at farm management. He grabbed a long-handled iron shovel, its blade gleaming under the flashlight like a short sword. Thomas lunged toward the stack of bags in the west corner. An alpha rat, as thick as a man's forearm with filthy gray fur, was nonchalantly gnawing at the top of a bag. As the shovel swung, it lunged away with incredible speed, vanishing into a gap between the wooden wall and the tin roof. Thud! The shovel struck the wooden floor, kicking up clouds of dust and shaking the aging barn. Thomas didn't stop. He was like a phantom in his own barn, the flashlight beam dancing chaotically on the walls. He struck, he swept, he landed blows of pure fury. Every time a seed bag tore further, he felt as if a piece of his own flesh were being flayed. To Thomas, each rat wasn't just a pest. They were the faces of bank creditors, the bureaucrats signing Billy's deployment orders, and the AgriCorp executives sitting in air-conditioned offices waiting for him to collapse. He cornered a rat behind the old cedar of the Farmall. It was trapped between the iron wheel and the wall. It turned, bared yellow teeth, and let out a sharp, defiant hiss. Thomas looked into its red eyes and saw himself, cornered, lonely, and feral. A split second of hesitation passed, but then the image of Billy's draft notice flashed in his mind. Thwack! The shovel drove straight down. The dry sound of crushing bone echoed in the dark. Thomas stood panting, sweat pouring down his neck despite the sub-zero temperature outside. But that tiny victory meant nothing. From the ancient oak rafters, other dark shadows began to move. They seemed to mock him. He could kill 1 or 10, but there were hundreds, thousands. They were the darkness swallowing his spring. He turned off the flashlight and stood in total darkness. He had to be smarter than them. Thomas remembered what his father once said. To beat a larger enemy, you can't just use strength. You have to understand what they fear. In the dark, Thomas heard the wind whistling through the door cracks, blending with the faint hum from the Zenith radio he hadn't turned off. A Jefferson Airplane song was playing, the sound distorted and eerie. A wild idea struck him. He approached the 1950 Farmall tractor, parked right by the barn door. Thomas climbed into the driver's seat, his hand fumbling for the ignition key. He didn't start the engine. The noise would make them vanish into unreachable crevices. Instead, he flipped on the Farmall's headlights. 2 dull white beams, powerful as giant eyes from the past, pierced the darkness of the barn. At the same time, he cranked the radio volume to the maximum. The screeching electric guitars of the late 60s reverberated off the wooden walls, creating a horrific, chaotic wall of sound. The rats, accustomed to the silence of the countryside, immediately fell into a state of extreme panic. They scurried frantically across the floor, colliding with one another, exposing themselves under the brilliant headlights. Thomas jumped down, the shovel in his hand now moving with a precise, cold rhythm. He no longer chased them. He waited for them to dash into the light. 1 strike, 2 strikes. He swept the barn floor like a reaper, harvesting a painful crop. Yet, amidst the slaughter, a surge of bitterness rose. Thomas looked at his 1950 Farmall, a symbol of an era where a farmer could live well just by working hard. Now, He had to use its very headlights to conduct a massacre in a barn just to protect bags of seed corn from destruction. Suddenly, he froze. In the middle of the floor, under the dappled light, he saw a small rat trying to drag a single kernel toward a hole at the base of the wall. It was tiny, scrawny, and trembling. Thomas raised the shovel, but then he lowered it. A painful thought flashed through his mind. It's just trying to survive, too. Just like he was trying to hold on to this farm. Just like Billy was facing an uncertain future in a distant land. All of them, from the 24-year-old farmer to this tiny creature, were merely pawns on the chessboard of an era that was far too cruel. Thomas switched off the Farmall's lights. The music on the radio died out as the station ended its nightly broadcast. The barn returned to a deathly silence, save for his heavy breathing. Thomas walked to the torn seed bag, knelt, and used his hands bleeding from splinters to scoop up the scattered corn. "That's enough for tonight," he whispered into the darkness. He knew this war couldn't be won with a shovel. Tomorrow, he would have to re-nail the barn walls with old tin sheets. He would have to stay awake and watch until these seeds were deep within the Iowa soil. Thomas stepped out of the barn and looked toward the horizon. A faint, blue-gray streak of light began to appear. The spring of 1969 was beginning with wounds and loneliness. But as his hand touched the cold steel shell of the Farmall, Thomas knew he would not back down. He would sow these seeds, even if it was the last thing he ever did on this land. Because for a farmer like Thomas, sometimes fighting in the dark is the only way to find the light of tomorrow. The first light of a March morning in Stormy County, Iowa, was not brilliant. It was a smudge of leaden gray, sluggish and sticky, slowly detaching itself from the horizon and casting shadows over the sodden fields. Thomas Sterling left the barn, his legs heavy as if weighted with lead. The wooden door let out a dry screech as he closed it, locking away the rat carcasses and the scent of death from a night of frenzied combat. He had just reached the porch when he froze. A glossy black sedan, a vehicle, utterly out of place in this sea of mud, was parked neatly under the old oak tree. A man in a sharp overcoat, holding a leather briefcase, stood leaning against the car, nonchalantly checking his watch. He was a representative from the Trust Bank of AgriCorp. "Mr. Sterling, I've been waiting 15 minutes, the man said, his voice as dry as turning paper. "I hope you weren't planning on spending this vital spring season hunting rats." Thomas didn't answer. He brushed past the man and pushed open the wooden door into the kitchen. The man followed uninvited, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the wooden floor, a stark contrast to Thomas's heavy boots. Thomas slumped into the oak chair at the head of the table, the seat that had belonged to his father. He didn't bother to remove his boots, which were caked in gray mud and dried streaks of rat blood. He lifted the old coffee pot and poured a thick, bitter black liquid into 2 chipped ceramic mugs. He pushed one toward the uninvited guest. "Black coffee. We don't have anything sweet here," Thomas said, his voice rasping as if there were sand in his throat. The bank rep glanced at the dirty mug with disgust and nudged it away. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a stack of documents, and placed them on the rough wooden table, right on top of Billy Sterling's draft notice. "I'm here to make a final offer to the Sterling family," he said, his eyes fixed on the raw scratches on Thomas's rough hands. "AgriCorp will buy these 80 acres for 1.5 times the market value. You'll have enough to wipe out your debts, and more importantly, enough to arrange things so your brother doesn't have to go to Vietnam. We all know money can change the position of a name on a deployment list, don't we?" Thomas stiffened. The hot coffee burned his throat. A deathly silence filled the kitchen, save for the ticking of the old wall clock. The offer was like a poisoned blade, stabbing the weakest point of his heart. Sell the ancestral land to save his brother's life. It was a devil's bargain, that the 20th century was hurling at small-time farmers. He looked at Billy's draft notice, pinned under the cold figures of debt. At 24, Thomas Sterling felt like he was standing in a courtroom where he was both the defendant and the judge. Outside, the transistor radio was still mumbling about man's preparation to conquer the moon. Humanity was flying high, but his honor was being dragged into the muck. "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked, his bloodshot eyes looking straight at the man. "Then the bank will seize all machinery next week. Your father's 1950 Farmall? It'll be auctioned for scrap." The rep shrugged, a triumphant half-smile appearing. "You'll be left with nothing. And Billy? He'll leave with a broken heart because his brother chose 80 acres of dry dirt over his life. Do you really think you can fight this era with an obsolete tractor, Sterling?" Anger erupted in Thomas's chest like an overheated engine. He stood up abruptly, sending the chair crashing to the floor. He grabbed the small bag of seeds he had rescued from the rats the night before and slammed it onto the table, sending golden corn kernels flying across the corporation's glossy documents. "Get out of my house," Thomas hissed through grit teeth, every word hammered like steel. "Take your goddamn numbers and get out." "You're going crazy, Thomas," the man said, standing up and taking a step back, his face flashing with a hint of terror at the wild, resolute look of the young man who had been awake all night. "I'm not crazy. I'm a Sterling." Thomas stepped closer, his breath smelling of coffee and extreme determination. "You see land. You see debt. I see life. You can take the machinery, but you will never buy my seeds. Tomorrow, I'm putting them in the ground. And if Billy has to go, he'll go with the pride that the Sterlings aren't cowards who sell their souls to people like you." The representative scrambled to grab his briefcase and hurried to the door, but not before leaving a spiteful remark. "We'll see how much your dignity is worth when the bank brings the tow trucks and your brother boards that troopship." The sedan's engine roared as it sped away, leaving a heavy silence in the kitchen. Thomas stood leaning against the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He picked up Billy's draft notice and smoothed it out with hands that were trembling but certain. The bitter taste of coffee lingered on his tongue, but in his veins, the blood of resilience ran stronger than ever. He stepped out the door, a March morning chill hitting his face and clearing his head. Thomas walked toward the red, rusted Farmall waiting in the fog. He climbed into the seat and turned the key. Once, twice. The engine roared with power, belching gray smoke into the air like a declaration of war against the world outside. Under the gray dawn of 1969, Thomas Sterling shifted into gear. Ahead of him lay a life-and-death season, but this time, he wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for the final dignity of a name, a farming family in an era that was slowly losing its soul. The 1950 Farmall's engine was growling, echoing across the yard when it suddenly cut out. Thomas Sterling froze in the driver's seat, hand still on the gear lever. From the dirt road leading into the farm, a thin figure wearing an old backpack was walking unsteadily through the unmelted frost. It was Billy. Thomas jumped down from the tractor, his legs wobbling on the slushy mud. He never expected his brother back so soon. Billy was supposed to be in town, finishing his last days of hired work to earn a bit of extra cash before his induction date arrived. But seeing Billy's appearance, his pale face, sunken eyes, and ragged breath, Thomas knew something terrible had happened. "Billy, why are you here?" Thomas rushed over, grabbing his brother's shoulders. Billy didn't answer immediately. He tremblingly pulled a sealed notice from his coat pocket, crumpling it in his palm. His voice broke. "They moved the date up, Tom. It's not August anymore. It's next week. They said the draft is critically short after Hamburger Hill. I have to report this Monday." The world seemed to collapse beneath Thomas's feet. This Monday? That meant they had less than 3 days. The bank rep's scheme from earlier was now crystal clear. AgriCorp had pulled strings to accelerate Billy's deployment, aiming to crush Thomas's will and force him to sign the land away immediately to buy his brother's way out. "They want us gone, Tom," Billy said, tears streaming down his sun-bronzed face. "I heard them talking at the post office. They said the Sterlings are the last splinter that needs to be pulled so the corporation's highway and industrial park can break ground. They're using me as a hostage for Dad's land." Thomas squeezed his brother's shoulders until his fingertips turned white. The fury of last night's rat battle, the resolve of breakfast with the bank rep, it all solidified into a cold, iron will. He looked into Billy's eyes, the gaze of a man pushed to the edge who no longer knew how to be afraid. "Listen to me, Billy," Thomas growled, his voice drowning out the radio, still blathering about spaceships. "We aren't selling an inch of land, and you aren't going anywhere. I'm going to the county draft office Monday morning. I'll bring the farm ledgers. I'll prove I can't run these 80 acres without you. That's the law essential farmers get a deferment during planting season. But Tom, the bank said they're seizing the Farmall next week. Without the tractor, we don't have a farm. Without the farm, I have no reason to stay." Billy cried out in despair. Thomas turned to look at the Red Lady, the 1950 Farmall idling and waiting. An old, rusted tractor, but it was their only weapon. "They won't get it. Tonight, I'm finishing the west field. Tomorrow is the east field. We're working through the night, Billy. Once those seeds are deep in the ground, this farm officially becomes an active production unit. The bank can't seize tools of production once the crop has started. That's the one loophole in Iowa law Dad once taught me." The two brothers stood there in the biting cold of spring 1969, surrounded by mud and the hostility of a new era. Out there, the rest of America was dreaming of the moon. But in Stormy County, the Sterling family was preparing for their final resistance. "Go inside and grab something to eat, then come back here to me," Thomas said, his voice now strangely calm. "Take the lanterns and those last sacks of pioneer seeds. Tonight, we'll show them the strength of men cornered." Billy looked at his brother and saw the shadow of their late father in Thomas's every decisive gesture. He wiped his tears and nodded firmly. Thomas Sterling climbed back into the seat. He no longer felt the fatigue of the sleepless night. He shifted into gear. The Farmall lunged forward, its iron chains grinding into the mud, carving deep furrows. The Sterling's life-or-death planting battle had begun. If humanity could conquer the universe, Thomas Sterling would conquer this land, with sweat, with recklessness, and with a fierce love for a brother standing on the brink of war. The Iowa sky at night turned deep purple, then ink black. The spring wind began to shriek through the barbed wire fences, carrying a bone-chilling cold and the heavy moisture of an approaching storm. In the west field, the two dull beams from the 1950 Farmall sliced through the night, illuminating the drizzle that had begun to fall. Thomas Sterling gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched to stop himself from shivering. Behind him, Billy stood on the cedar platform, one hand gripping the iron frame, the other holding a lantern to shield the precious corn seeds from the rain. They had worked for 6 hours straight. Straight furrows emerged under the lights, promising a new beginning, but time was draining away with every tick of the fateful clock. "Hold on, old girl. Only 10 more acres," Thomas shouted over the wind. But right then, a horrific sound echoed. A sharp clack, clack, clack came from the engine bay, followed by the sound of violent metal-on-metal impact. The Farmall shuddered and stalled, black smoke billowing from the exhaust, obscuring Thomas's vision. The engine faded and died, leaving only the howling wind and the deepening rain. "No, it can't be," Thomas screamed. He lunged into the mud, his shaking hands flipping open the scorching hot hood. Under Billy's swaying lantern light, the scene was grim. The main drive belt had snapped, and part of the fuel pump was deformed from overexertion. In the darkness of 1969, in the middle of a sodden field, this was a death sentence for Sterling Farm. "We're done, Tom." Billy slumped into the mud, his face a mask of despair under the oil lamp. "The bank comes Monday morning. Without the tractor, we can't finish." Am I really going to Vietnam?" Thomas looked at the steaming heap of scrap metal, his heart tightening. A sense of helplessness surged, stronger than the spring chill. He looked into the distance, where the flickering lights of town seemed to mock their solitude. But then, his gaze fell on Billy's trembling hands. He remembered his father's words. "A farmer doesn't lose because the machine breaks. He only loses when his heart grows cold." "Billy, get the toolkit from under the seat," Thomas barked, his voice hardening like cold steel. "But Tom, we don't have spare parts. The belt is shredded. Get the rope and the leather tape from the iron box. We'll knot it and wrap it. The fuel pump is jammed. I'll use a manual lever to force it. You sit in the seat. When I signal, you shift as fast as you can." For the next 2 hours, under a torrential Iowa downpour, the two Sterling brothers performed an impossible surgery on the carcass of the Farmall. Thomas lay on his back under the machine, grime and oil flowing into his eyes and mouth. He used every ounce of his 24-year-old strength to straighten bent metal rods, using braided rope to replace the lost drive belt. Blood from the scratches on his hands mingled with the engine oil, staining the mud red. "Billy, try it again." The starter let out a whir-whir, then went silent. Thomas gritted his teeth, his iron hammer striking the starter solenoid. Again. Sputter, 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 roar. The engine fired back to life. Though the sound was clattering and unstable, the black smoke it belched this time carried the very life of the Sterling family. Thomas crawled out from under the chassis, his face blackened by oil, but his eyes burning like fire. "Get on. We have to finish before the sun comes up." The aging Farmall lurched forward again, slow and agonizing, like a wounded soldier crawling toward the trench. Thomas held the wheel with one hand and gripped the manual fuel pump lever with the other. Every yard the machine gained was an extraordinary effort of muscle and will. The sky began to pale. The first rays of light pierced the thin rain, shining down on the west field, now filled with freshly sown furrows. As the final seed left the planter, the Farmall's engine officially collapsed, the sound fading away forever. Thomas and Billy sat down in the middle of the muddy field, leaning their backs against the massive iron wheel. They looked toward the road leading to the farm. A black bank car was slowly approaching, but this time, Thomas was no longer afraid. He looked down at his hands, drenched in blood and oil, then over at Billy. They had won. Not the war in Vietnam, and not against the massive AgriCorp, but against the very fate that sought to grind them down. 80 acres were sown. The Sterling dignity was stamped into the Iowa soil. Under the spring sky of 1969, amidst the scent of earth and engine oil, Thomas Sterling smiled. He knew the road ahead was still fraught with hardship, but at least tonight, the darkness had failed to swallow them. The glossy black sedan stopped at the edge of the west field. The representative stepped out, his expensive leather shoes immediately sinking into the slushy Iowa muck. He grimaced, adjusting his overcoat collar, then froze as he took in the scene. Thomas Sterling stood leaning against the dead Farmall, his arms hanging limp, his clothes torn and blackened by grease. Beside him, Billy sat on the ground, his face smeared with dirt, but his eyes glowing with defiance. Behind them lay 80 acres of overturned earth, the furrows straight, dark brown, and rain-soaked, hiding millions of seeds sown in a single night of madness. The representative stepped forward, the foreclosure documents in his hand, suddenly looking out of place. He looked at the rusted, smoking Farmall, then out at the vast, completed field. "Mr. Sterling, you actually did it?" He stammered, his voice stripped of its usual triumph. In a storm with this piece of junk? Thomas didn't rush to answer. He slowly pulled Billy's draft notice from his breast pocket, showing the man the prints of mud and oil smeared upon it. "Sterling Farm is officially in season, sir," Thomas said, his voice raspy but clear in the still air. "Under Iowa state law, this is now an essential food production unit in operation. You can seize the machines, but you can't touch the land once the seeds have sprouted. And you can't take my brother when he's the only labor left to harvest this crop." The bank rep looked into Thomas's bloodshot eyes, the eyes of a man who had walked through the dark and brought the light back with him. He realized that the debt figures and AgriCorp schemes had hit an unbreakable wall, the pride of a farming family bound to their land. The man sighed, slowly tucking the documents back into his briefcase. "You win this round, Sterling. The bank will send a notice extending the debt until the end of the harvest. But remember, the land shows no mercy, and neither does this era." "The land doesn't show mercy, but it is fair," Thomas replied, looking down at the mud beneath his feet. "It gives back exactly what we've traded in sweat and blood." As the black sedan turned around and vanished into the fog, Thomas turned to his brother. Billy stood up, brushed the mud from his shirt, and smiled a smile of freedom that no amount of AgriCorp money could ever buy. The year 1969 continued with flights to the moon and fierce battles in distant lands. But in a small corner of Stormy County, Iowa, a red Farmall stood as a monument to endurance. Thomas Sterling knew that the coming autumn would bring more struggles, but tonight he had sown more than just corn. He had sown the belief that as long as a man stands firm on his own ground, the darkness will never win. The true dawn had finally arrived at Sterling Farm.